Andrew Austin here, the FAR Podcast, the podcast vlog associated with the Freedom and Reason blog. You can read my blog at andrewaustin.blog. I want to encourage you to head on over there, subscribe, comment, and subscribe to my podcast. There was an interesting story in The Hill several days ago. The title was provocative. Ted Cruz bashes Oprah for a lecture on race. What utter racist BS. What utter racist BS was what Ted Cruz said. What was he responding to? Well, he was responding to something that Oprah Winfrey said, and this is in the context of her new talk show. So I read through the article and then checked out the videos that he was referring to. And what struck me, and I'll get to the Oprah Winfrey piece in a minute, but what struck me immediately was this person. This is Emmanuel Acho, and Emmanuel Acho is a former NFL linebacker, current sports analyst on Fox, and he's declaring, so let me just real quickly tell you how the setup is really strange. So it's in an all-white room, very barren room. Oprah's sitting in a chair. Looks like something sort of out of, The Matrix. And there is this mirror leaning up against the wall. So you're looking, your vantage point initially is looking at Oprah's left side. And so she's staring across at this, what looks like one of those full-length mirrors, that you have on the back of your closet door, leaning up against the wall. And Acho appears in that mirror. And then she has to his left across the wall several smaller what looks like a picture frame. There's like 5, I think there were 5 of them. She had 3 guests in addition to Acho, so there were 3 that had faces in them, and they're talking about white people and whiteness and all of that stuff. So that's what the scene looks like. You can find the video online. And so he's on there, and he says, white people run America. This is what he says. And I want to quote what he says because it's revealing. Acho said this, quote, CEOs, Fortune 500 companies, executives, ownership, they run America. And actually he didn't say executives. What he said was CEOs, Fortune 500 companies, execs, ownership, they run America. Not an individual white person. I'm still quoting him, not an individual white person, but collective white people. Collective white people. So we have white people run America is the argument. Not an individual white person, collective white people. And it's important that you emphasize that it's not an individual white person because you have white people who are homeless on the street. So clearly they don't run America. So it has to be a collective thing. So it's an abstraction. So you have this abstract category, collective white people. This sounds a lot like a conspiracy theory I've heard before. Maybe it sounds that way to you too. Let me explain what I mean by that. First, let me say that I elaborate my views on this on my blog that I recently published titled Reparations and Blood Guilt. And I was inspired by observations by Coleman Hughes. It struck me, he said, when we talk about black poverty and we want to say white people are responsible, and so we have this whole analysis of white privilege and so forth, he said, you'll notice that that's in fashion. It's very easy to say. Let's suppose that we were going to make an argument about white Protestant poverty, and we were going to explain that in terms of Jewish power and Jewish wealth, Jewish privilege, right? And I thought, oh, goodness, well, you don't pursue that analysis. Why? Well, as Coleman Hughes says, one thing, if you did an analysis like that, people would straight away be suspicious of you. And that's anti-Semitic, right? This idea of a Jewish cabal running the world. So you don't go there, but yet it's really easy to attribute black poverty, the suffering of blacks, to a white cabal. And I thought that's really a brilliant analogy. I hadn't thought of that. And so I riffed on it, and I wrote a lengthier essay on it, sort of following through. He just sort of dropped it. So it was like a multi-part answer. And he said, well, first we have to say this. And then he moved on from that. And I thought, wow, you could have pursued that further. So I did. So I want to encourage you to go read that. But I also want to make sure that you understand that it was Coleman Hughes who inspired me to write that. So here's the conspiracy theory as I understand it. You have CEOs, Fortune 500 companies that comprise collective white rule, and let me just run with it, and not hold back and sort of really get to what does this thing sound like? Well, let's bring up a fact. We know for a fact that Jews disproportionately occupy these positions of power and privilege. I'm not even going to engage in an explanation for how that happens, but it happens to be true. So you have this conspiracy theory that says that Jews and their white, Gentile allies, and so are Jews white or not white? There's always that question, but these are European Jews, white European Jews, and their Gentile white allies. Together they run America. Now, I'm not making this up. Louis Farrakhan advances this thesis. Louis Farrakhan is the leader of the Nation of Islam. And in fact, this is a big, in the Islamic world. Of course, Louis Farrakhan, this is black Islam, but he's a black Muslim. But in Islam generally, there's this theory. I don't know if you looked at the newspapers from that part of the world, but the idea is that Jews pull the strings, Jews control things, and the Jews control, the white Christians. In dominating the world. And in fact, this white privilege argument is something that the New Left takes up, and they're very pro-Islam, as you know. And so there's definitely a connection in all of this. So Louis Farrakhan isn't the only one who makes this argument. One can hear this all over the place. In fact, there's a version of this theory. It leaves the Jews out because it doesn't want to sound anti-Semitic, and so what it does is it puts it all on white people, collective white people, as Acho would say. Then you find this in the humanities, and you find it in the social science departments at our colleges and universities. Some of you already know this, but I am a professor at a public university. I teach in a program that's focused on democracy and justice, and I'm trained as a sociologist, and so I went through graduate school. I swam in a sea of this way of thinking, where these abstractions, structures and theoretical structures become realities in people's minds. And there's a long history here, and I'm not going to go through the history in this podcast. I'll come back in a later podcast and go through the whole history of this, but the point I want to make here is that dressing conspiracism in pseudo-intellectual clothing, the pseudo-intellectual clothing of woke social science, doesn't make it any better. So what has happened over the last several decades is this conspiracy theory that, so first of all, there was a time when whites did have a legal system that systematically privileged whites. And so they were poor whites and they suffered and so forth, but they could drink out of a water fountain with wealthier whites, whereas black people couldn't, whether they were wealthy or poor, couldn't drink out of the same water fountains. You know this history. I hope you know this history. And so, but that system was dismantled more than half a century ago. And so at that time in the 60s, they created this idea of institutional racism. So we actually dismantled institutional racism, and realizing that a nice attack point was being lost, now all of a sudden this language of institutional racism emerges, and now it's systemic racism. You hear that even more often, and it leverages the theoretical language of social science, and sociology is the major culprit in developing this language. And so what it does is it disappears concrete individuals who may be rich, who may be poor, who may be anything. It disappears them into abstract categories that are defined by race. So it sees groups first, racialized groups, and individuals second, right? So so you might say, well, that sounds like stereotyping. That sounds like racism itself. And the answer is yes, that's what's happened. So anti-racism is a new racism. Acho said several other things here. He said, here's what I told my friends and their white children. I said, Y'all live in a white cul-de-sac, in a white neighborhood, in a white city, in a white state. If you are not careful, your children will live their whole white life, and at 26, 27, they'll end up being part of the problem because you just let them and allowed them to live in a completely white, sheltered, and culturalist life. Culturalist. So I'll just leave that there. Okay, so that's Acho. Enough about him. But let's get real with this with the argument here, right? So that's a fantasy that he's arguing. It's just bizarre. In real life, America is run by capitalists and their functionaries, not run by white people. We live in a capitalist society, and the legal system, the political system, the state, etc., all exist in order to perpetuate that mode of production. We don't live in an apartheid society. We don't. We abolished that. And we abolished it through a lot of grassroots popular struggle. And we ought to be very proud of ourselves for getting rid of that. Any privileges that white people enjoyed were abolished decades ago. So when you hear this kind of rhetoric, white privilege rhetoric, and I want to sandwich something in between what he says and what Oprah says, because after I tell you, to think about this, and then when you hear what Oprah says, you realize how insulting it is. How does an out-of-work white coal miner in West Virginia lives in a trailer? He's addicted to fentanyl made in China. It's carried across the United States by Mexican cartels enabled by lax border control. How does he figure into the white ruling caste? And that word caste is something that people are really keying in on. That's a word that was used many decades ago to talk about the United States by a group of scholars. And again, I'm not going to go into that whole history, but I'll come back to this word caste, and so I want you to be ready for that. So I'm trying to understand, when I'm listening to this, the logic of this vast white conspiracy to run America. And I'm a plain Marxist. I do class analysis. I do political economic analysis. I look at the structure of society. And what I see is a property system protected by the law, protected by the state, that doesn't really care what color you are. It really doesn't. So you have poor whites and you have rich blacks. So this is Oprah Winfrey. Don't even really need a picture for her, I guess. But my question is, before I get to the things she said, when I hear this argument that's being made, and she's making this argument, how did she get to be so rich? And she's a billionaire, a couple billion. And she's not the only wealthy black person. What about the late millionaire Herman Cain? Remember him? He was in the news recently. He died of COVID-19, and progressives mocked him for dying from COVID-19 because he went to a Trump rally without a mask. And as you know, progressives are full of empathy, and they're reluctant to attack people who die from COVID. And the fact that they seem so giddy when they produce these memes and mock people who are dead, just put that aside. That's just their passion for truth and justice. And okay, so I could go on all day giving examples of prominent and wealthy black men and women. One of them served 2 terms as president. He remains wildly popular. I can't go a week without, on my Facebook page, seeing a meme of Barack Obama and his family with verbiage, extolling his virtues and what a man of class and grace, and there were no scandals and so forth. So our prominent and successful blacks like Winfrey and Obama, are they part of a white cabal to run the world, to trick everybody into believing that race really isn't a problem? Because if it's a vast white conspiracy to run the world, you have this problem of prominent blacks, wealthy, privileged blacks throughout the class structure. How does that happen? How does that happen if it's a white supremacist system? So maybe they're collaborators right? Wealthy blacks. They are selected, they are privileged so that they push a line. Does that sound plausible to you? I just put that out there, and you can think about that. Or is Winfrey a capitalist, Obama a functionary for the capitalist class, like so many wealthy white people are? Does that seem more plausible? It does to me. And in fact, that's what's going on. Here's what Oprah says. There are white people who are not as powerful as the system of white people. So system of white people is collective white people. It's the same sort of language. The caste system that's been put in place, but they still, no matter where they are on the rung or the ladder of success, they still have their whiteness. You still have your whiteness. That's what the term white privilege is. I'm quoting her. She goes on. It means that whiteness still gives you an advantage no matter. So if you're under the ladder, if you're a homeless person leaning up against the wall and you've got nothing, you've lost everything, don't feel completely terrible, because you have something that is of value, and that's your whiteness. All right. And so even though Oprah Winfrey has $2-3 billion, that's her net worth, as I understand it, even though that's her situation, you have a privilege she doesn't have. The homeless person, the person who's addicted to drugs, or an alcoholic who's lost everything. All right. That person has something that she doesn't have, and that's this privileged skin color. So Ted Cruz calls this racist BS, and he's right. He's right. This is racist. This is a racist argument. Now, Ted and yours truly, we hail from radically different perspectives. As I said earlier, I said I'm a plain Marxist, and certainly Ted Cruz is not. So I'm going to tell you something that he won't about this situation, and that's that capitalists sow racial division to disrupt proletarian consciousness or working class consciousness. That's what they do. They've been doing this for hundreds of years. At different moments in history, the system of racial antagonism gets tweaked for effectiveness. So when people rose up and said, we want to honor the American creed that, from the Declaration of Independence about our inherent equality, and it seems that Jim Crow segregation is a contradiction of that, we pushed, a coalition of black and white Americans pushed, and we changed the law, right? We raised consciousness about the problems of Jim Crow segregation, and we changed the law. We changed America. That's pretty important. But the ruling class is, well, we were using race. It was so successful in dividing the working class, because if we can get black and white workers to war against each other, to hate each other, then we can maintain control over the population. But, alas, they rose up, they got rid of Jim Crow segregation. Now we live in a country without a legal system that systematically privileges whites. So we have to come up with a new way of dividing the population by race. And so you get white privilege. So the contemporary version of racism is white privilege, white fragility, systemic racism, institutional racism, anti-racism, all of this rhetoric. And I write extensively about this new form of racism on my blog and introduce you to several writers that are pushing this line. So Oprah Winfrey's part of a prevailing hegemony. That's her role in this. And she's taken up the language of fragility and caste to perpetuate a system of class privilege. This is the privilege she enjoys. She doesn't enjoy white privilege. She enjoys class privilege. And she's part of the ruling establishment of this country. And so they push this line. I'm not even accusing her of doing this intentionally. This is part of, remember what Karl Marx argued in throughout his work, in fact, where he said, that those who control the material means of production control the intellectual means of production, right? So if you want to understand the ideas that are prevailing in any given epoch, look at who controls the foundation of society, right? They're the ones who are going to develop the ideas that justify their rule. This is ideology. I'm reminded in all of this by Adolph Reed Jr. As a political scientist. He's retired now, but still very active. Retired from the university, hasn't retired from making arguments. You go out on the internet and search for Adolph Reed Jr. and you will not be disappointed. Absolutely brilliant man. And he wrote an article years ago. It was I'm not sure. It was fairly recently, but he was reflecting on something that happened many years earlier. It was a 1991 conference at Harvard Law School, and it had to do with Derek Bell, who's an esteemed legal theorist, who was a tenured full professor. And so let me just read what Adolph Reed says. He says, at a 1991 conference at Harvard Law School, where he was a tenured full professor, I heard the late esteemed legal theorist Derek Bell declare on a panel that blacks had made no progress since 1865. I was startled, not least because Bell's own life, as well as the fact that Harvard's Black Law Students organization put on the conference, so emphatically belied his claim. I have since come to understand that those who make such claims experience no sense of contradiction because the contention that nothing has changed is intended actually as an assertion that racism persists as the most consequential force impeding Black Americans' aspirations. That no matter how successful or financially secure individual Black people become, they remain similarly subject to victimization by racism. And the article is titled "A Neoliberal Alternative, Anti-Racism, a Neoliberal Alternative to the Left." So you can go out and read the rest of it. This is a brilliant insight, and it's there. John McWhorter, Glenn Loury. There's a lot of other Black scholars out there who make this argument. So you should go out and familiarize yourself with these voices. Don't think that all Black people are pushing the white privilege, white fragility line. It's not true. It is radical and liberal and conservative Black scholars. So it's across the political spectrum are pointing out that this anti-racism argument is designed or functions to obscure the social class relation. We're not going to solve our actual problems with this. It's going to perpetuate our problems. So this is journalist Isabel Wilkerson, and she's the author of Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. And this is the book that's got Oprah talking about caste. And I should say that Wilkerson, her previous book was about Black migration, the Great Migration from the South to the North. I don't know if you know this, but prior to 1910s, 1920s, about half of Black people lived in the South, and then they began to move to the northeastern cities and Midwestern cities. And so today, did I say half? I meant 90% of Blacks lived in the South. Now about half do because of this Great Migration, and there's some interesting dynamics now where Blacks are beginning to move back to the South for various reasons. But that book is called The Warmth of Other Suns, SUNS, The Warmth of Other Suns, The Epic Story of America's Great Migration. And unlike Reed and McWhorter and Loury and others, she believes systemic racism does exist, and she believes that a caste system exists. And in a recent article in New York Times Magazine, I think Caste, the book, is going to be is just out or is about to be released. So I know what's in it. People have talked a lot about it. I haven't read the book, but I have read an article that she wrote for the New York Times Magazine entitled "America's Enduring Caste System." So this is her argument in summary. So that's very useful, and I would encourage you to go out and find that and read that. Let me just quote some of it. I have 3 passages here, but I'm not going to read all of them, because you'll get the gist very quickly. But she said, quoting her, "We saw a man face down on the pavement, pinned beneath a car, and above him another man, a man in uniform, his skin lighter than the man on the ground, and the lighter man was bearing down on the darker man, his knee boring into the neck of the darker man, the lighter man's hands at his side in his pockets. Could it be that his hands were so nonchalantly in his pockets? Such was the ease and casual calm, the confidence of embedded entitlement with which he was able to lord over the darker man." Okay, so she goes on so we watched this man die before our eyes. "What we did not see, not immediately anyway, was the invisible scaffolding, a caste system with ancient rules and assumptions that made such a horror possible, that held each actor in that scene in its grip. Off camera, 2 other men in uniform who looked like the lighter man were holding down a darker man from the other side of the police car as dusk approached in Minneapolis. Yet another man in uniform of Asian descent, and thus not in the dominant caste, stood near, watching, immobilized, it seemed, at a remove from his own humanity and potential common cause as the darker man slipped out of consciousness." There's a lot of assumptions going on there, right? "We soon learned that the man on the ground, George Floyd, had been accused of trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. The uncountable black men over the centuries, or like uncountable black men over the centuries, lost his life over what might have been a mere citation for people in the dominant caste." Those, they're meant to be powerful words. I'll let you judge that. But does Wilkerson know about Tony Timpa? Do you know about Tony Timpa? This was in 2016, Dallas, Texas. White man suffocated by the police. You should look into it. What were the ancient rules that killed Timpa? These ancient rules, the rules and assumptions, what were they? Did you know that most people who are killed by the police are white and not black? What ancient rules are at work there? And not by a little. And I recently did a podcast on this. You can listen to that and read the numerous blogs that I've made about this. One of my major areas of specialization in sociology is criminology, so I write on this subject. What is the invisible scaffolding that causes cops to kill so many more white people than black people every year? What's the invisible scaffolding that causes the media to only tell you about the black men who are killed by the police and not tell you about the white men who are killed by the police? That's interesting. What were the ancient rules in play when Ryan Whitaker was shot by a Phoenix police officer on May 21st of this year? You didn't hear anything about it. A few days later, George Floyd is killed, and all hell breaks loose in America. Just a few days before that, Ryan Whitaker is shot by a Phoenix police officer. And the video, it's all captured. You can see it. It's devastating. It's terrible. He steps outside. He quickly realizes, oh my God, these are the cops. He tries to submit, go down on the ground, and they shoot him in the back. His girlfriend comes out, watches her boyfriend die. The neighbor who called the cops over noise, he said to the cops he was trying to get sleep. They were playing video games and making salsa and having a good time. They were being noisy, and he can be heard on the 911 call saying to the dispatcher, "Could be physical. I could say yeah, if that makes anybody hurry on up." This is John Blake, and he writes for CNN and works for CNN. And CNN published an essay he wrote called "How Good White People Derail Racial Progress." And this is typical of contemporary anti-racist discourse. He consults the Economic Policy Institute, the EPI. That's well, by the way, I mean, EPI, people talk about all the time. And so just so you know, you might hear the acronym. That's what that means, Economic Policy Institute. It's been around for quite a while. Sort of a go-to source for progressives. And he goes there for this statistic. Less than 13% of white students attend a school where a majority of students are black. Less than 13% of white students attend a school where a majority of students are black. And he dramatizes this number with 60 years after the Supreme Court declared separate but equal schools unconstitutional, American schools remain heavily segregated by race and ethnicity. I think he pulls that quote from EPI. So less than 13% of white students attend a school where a majority of students are black. I want you to stop and reflect on that for just a minute, because I don't know if people know this. I ask my students this question a lot. What percentage of the population do you think are black? And some know because they've been in classes and have learned about it. But people who don't know tend to overestimate the proportion in the population. In fact, blacks are only around 13% of the U.S. population. So you have to ask, how would one propose substantially raising the percentage of whites going to majority black schools when blacks are not even the largest minority in America? It's a very strange statistic to quote. Anyway, when you read the essay, you very quickly realize that Blake is perfect for CNN. I don't know if you watch CNN, but they for a long time have been all in on painting whites as racist, in particularly conservative whites. This article, this op-ed I'm talking about, when it first came out, you'll see this often. There's a grabber that comes out, and then they'll revise the headline a few hours later. The original one, what got my attention with this originally is it said that white liberals are dangerous. So it's not it's all whites, right, are the problem. And Blake tells us, unless more white people are willing to give up something to change the racial makeup of where they live and send their children to school, there will be no true racial awakening in America. So Acho says something very similar, right? And you have to wonder, why is the situation of racial inequality always pitched as a zero-sum game? Why is that? And when he says, unless more whites are willing to give up something, give up what? I mean, it seems to me that we should be striving for an America where everyone enjoys high standards of living, with leisure time and all the things that middle-class people enjoy, not what can we take. I don't know if you've been watching what's happening in Portland, but these rioters have been invading residential neighborhoods and demanding houses. Give us your houses. Give us your property. Give us your stuff. Now, you need less so that we can have this stuff. And it's like, well, let's work together to figure out how we can make it possible for you to have the kind of comfort that people in these residential communities have. Let's solve problems, not just take from other people. I made this argument before, but you see this a lot when, whites not being routinely pulled over by the police is characterized as a privilege. But to be, to go through your life unmolested by the police if you haven't broken the rules, that's not a privilege, that's a right. So if there's some pattern that suggests that black people are being deprived of their rights, then we need to tackle that problem, not equalize the problem. Let's get rid of the problem. And then he says, because I already read this, about no true racial awakening in America. What about the Civil War and Reconstruction and civil rights? These weren't moments of true racial awakening? Who sneaked those three amendments into the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? Who did that? How did the Civil Rights Act of 1964 happen? And when you hear this, no true racial awakening, you say, well, what would a true racial awakening constitute if it's give us your houses, give us your cars, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a racial awakening. Well, it's a racial awakening of a different kind, isn't it? That's racist, in fact, and that's very dangerous. So, but to ignore all of the true moments of racial awakening where we achieved greater justice, where we were able to align our creed, and this is the proof of the efficacy of our republic, align our creed, realign our society to match our creed. What anti-racist ideology does is it wants to erase that. It wants to erase the collective memory of American progress in race relations. Why, if we're promoting racially integrated communities in schools, why, if that's a goal we want, I hope it's a goal. I don't think that's the goal of the New Left. I think they want to, they want to eliminate these communities, completely reorganize them along their radical ideas of what society should look like. But I'm still an old left guy, and what I want to see is racially integrated communities. I want to see working people, black and white, together in the same communities, in the same schools. I think we need to think about social class is what I think we need to focus on. So, why do progressives push divisive identity politics? Who is it that teaches our children and tells their parents to see race first and person second? So, I believe in individual rights. There's an argument for group rights. Well, group rights is what you had under Jim Crow segregation. White privilege is group rights. So, why are we dividing up the population by race and talking about it in that way? Who is it that defines Western norms and values, the values of individualism and industriousness, as white culture? Why is that white culture? Right? Western civilization, the American Republic, they're based on values: secularism, liberalism, humanism, democracy, republicanism, human rights, etc. Everybody can have these values. There's nothing that makes them white. Did they originate in a white majority, civilization? Yes, they did. But that doesn't mean they can't be for everybody. What makes them white specifically? Well, since race is a social construct, it seems ideology makes it that way. Who is it that's systematically glossing over the chief determinants of our life chances? The social class and economics. Who is it that's glossing over that? We have to stop saying that color blindness is racist. Of course, we're not colorblind. We see race. You don't end a practice that's hundreds of years in development. But that's the goal that you strive for. That's what Martin Luther King's dream was. And you're seeing a lot of delegitimizing going on. And King is one of the targets of the attack. So they're overthrowing the civil rights paradigm that I've always believed in. We have to stop demanding group rights over individual rights and get back to that old civil rights message. We want to strive for color blindness. We want to get back to the ethics of humanism. We want to get back to the politics of social class, economic justice. We have to stop perpetuating the myth that individuals are meaningfully divided by race or scientific racism. We need to stop racially essentializing culture. And there are no laws stopping black people from living in majority white neighborhoods or sending their children to majority white schools. So this talk about white people giving up something for the sake of justice, as if they are the cause of inequality and poverty in America. I want to encourage you to look instead at the structure of capital ownership and control, determine which groups actually control the way life happens in society. And I would suggest to you, when you do a close examination, you'll find that it's corporations. White people don't run things. That's not how it works. This is not an apartheid system. We got rid of that system, as I said before, more than 50 years ago. And we need to stop pushing race antagonism and get back to class solidarity. That's how we're going to solve the problems of inequality in America. Remember, if you eliminate poverty for everybody, you eliminate poverty for black people. Thank you for listening.